Firstly, welcome to this RCC Pilotage Foundation webinar on crossing the Atlantic Ocean. My name is Tom Partridge, and today I'm joined by Jane Russell, author of the Atlantic Crossing Guide. Welcome again, Jane.
Hi, Tom. Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for being patient with us.
So, Jane, let's jump straight in. What inspired you to take on writing the Atlantic Crossing Guide?
Well, I remember what it felt like to be dreaming about crossing the Atlantic and wondering whether or not it was something that I could achieve. And I wanted to encourage other sailors to think through their dreams and hopefully help them to turn their dreams into reality.
So you talk about dreams. What is a dream that sailors have in crossing the Atlantic?
Well, I think for most people it's this. It's being anchored off a tropical island, but more than that, it's knowing that you've got there under your own steam and that this is your reward for all the planning and the effort. I do think the getting there is just as important as the being there, because that's where the sense of achievement and fulfillment comes from. I think people are dreaming of moments like this. They're thinking of downwind sailing mostly, and moments like dolphins leaping. Dolphins are great. They never fail to lift spirits and seem to show off just for the joy of it, which is a very infectious joy and lifts morale even on the worst of days.
So does the book just focus on your classic so-called downwind tropical routes?
No, actually, in the past few years, there's been quite an interest in the old ice routes because they've become a lot less icy, basically. And so a number of boats each year are now going across the far north and visiting Greenland and Iceland, where you get this wonderful landscape of ice and rock and absolutely stunning light, and the bonus of the long day length, of course.
Okay, let's talk a bit more about the routes for crossing the Atlantic.
Okay, so this chart gives you a good idea of the possible routes. You have a broad choice of different start and finishing points for your passages. So you might be going from the USA to Bermuda and across to the Azores and then Northern Europe, or you might be coming from Northern Europe or the Mediterranean and going across to the Caribbean, or you might be going on the Viking routes from Norway to Newfoundland or from Newfoundland back to Norway. If I'm honest, I suppose the book should really be called the North Atlantic Crossing Guide because that is the main focus, but I do talk a bit about the routes to Brazil or the Guianas and also up from South Africa to the Caribbean as well.
So is the crossing the main feature for cruising sailors?
No, I think most people are really looking forward to their cruising grounds when they've completed their passages. The ocean passages for their own sake are probably not really what they're dreaming of. That's a part of it, but not the whole. The Atlantic is a wonderful carousel because there are so many fantastic cruising grounds all around the edge of the circuit. So when you have finished your passage, you've got lots of choice for where you're going to stop off and spend more time and explore.
Okay, so we'll talk a bit more about some of those places later, but if someone is dreaming the dream, what are the things they might need to start thinking about?
Well, I think it's really important to start with the basics and ask yourself some questions. What's the budget? Everyone's going to come at this differently. You might be retired with lots of money, or you might be younger and relatively penniless. So either way, you need to decide what your budget's going to be. The recently reported average was about $16,000 a year, but there are plenty of people cruising at a lot less than that, and a fair number who are spending probably 10 times that or more. What's your time scale? Are you doing this for the rest of your life, or are you going for a gap year, or maybe you're just hoping for a quick dash to tick it off your bucket list? How you need to prepare is going to be very different in each of these scenarios. Who am I going to go with? You might be single, you might be in a partnership, or you might be part of a bigger team or group. Your preparations obviously need to take into account everyone who's involved, and some of them might be less enthusiastic than others. So it's really important to work as a team right from the start of the preparations. Which route are you going to take? Is it going to be downwind all the way? Do you want the challenge of some upwind times? Do you head for the coral? Do you head for the ice? Or are you wanting a mix of everything? Obviously, your equipment and your provisioning is going to depend on where you're heading. And then this question of why, which I think is an important one.
You say important. Why is that?
I think really, if you are dreaming of sailing alone into the sunset and taking as long as it takes and going where the winds blow you, you're going to be making very different decisions to someone who's part of a bigger crew and maybe is on a mission or racing. So if you know why you want to do it, you're going to make the preparations that are right for you.
Jane, some of your readers might not have the cruising experience to know exactly what they want or why they want to do it, or their ideas might even change over time.
Yes, I know, but hopefully in encouraging everyone to think through the various options, I'm helping them to find the right solutions for them.
I should just mention it at this stage, if anybody has got any questions, please do submit them. You can see it on your screen, there's a place there, and we will try and tackle most of those questions as we can at the end of this webinar. Okay, so going back to what we were saying, Jane, can you give me, what's a good example of how people might make different choices?
Okay, well, an obvious one is the discussion about power usage on board, power in versus power out. Most boats have some sort of self-steering arrangement. Traditionally, that would have always been some kind of vane gear like this. A lot of long-distance cruising boats still rely on vane steering. It's the extra helmsman, keeps going forever, doesn't need to eat or sleep. And there's no power draw. In fact, in this photo, you can see a tow generator being deployed. So power is actually being generated without being used up by the steering system. So it's a win-win of power in and no power out. But nowadays, a lot of cruising boats rely on electric autopilots, which have quite a big power draw. So then you have to think about power generation, which might mean solar panels, or it might mean a water power generator, which you either tow or, like this one, drop down over your stern. It might mean a wind generator, a combination, all of those. Or if you have a big enough boat, then it can mean a walk-in engine room with auxiliary generators. Self-steering is really just one example of what I'm talking about, but your solutions to power draw versus power input depends on what your idea of cruising is. Some people like to keep things as simple as possible. Other people feel that they need every piece of technology available. One person's luxury is sometimes another person's necessity.
And yourself, Jane, what do you think?
Well, I think it's always a balance, but I have noticed over the years that the longer time people spend cruising, the more likely they are to choose to simplify things as much as possible. And personally, I would always rather be anchored in the bay with the breeze blowing through the cockpit rather than being in a marina with the air conditioning on.
So you mentioned choosing who to go with. What do most people elect to do on a crossing?
The majority of cruising boats are crewed by couples, but lots of people sail as part of a bigger team, and especially for something like the Atlantic, and definitely on a first crossing when it's normal to feel a bit nervous. There's that camaraderie of shared adventure, which I think probably helps with confidence and adds to the appeal, as I think you experienced when you crossed the first time.
Yes, looking at that photograph, I think I recognise the fugitive in the middle of that picture.
Lots of shared memories. I think going as a group is one of the main reasons people decide to join one of the Atlantic rallies, the social side. It's a big part of the decision making.
I'm guessing that some people might find it quite hard to think about being on a boat for a long time. How long is a typical Atlantic crossing?
Well, it depends on your route, obviously, and how fast your boat sails, but the longest passage is usually about 3.5 weeks. It can be less than that if you're racing.
And any advice on ensuring there is good team morale?
Yeah, morale's an important one. everyone has good days and bad days, and the trick is to learn how to give one another some time and some space. And I think it's also about making sure that everyone has something to learn, because all of us have something to learn, even the saltiest sea dog. It might mean navigation skills, it might mean learning to play the guitar or learning some new tunes, it might be learning about getting creative in the galley, or it's keeping a journal or writing a daily blog. And also, it's easy to forget that when you're out there in the middle of an ocean on a small boat, you really are at the frontier of knowledge and experience. There's so much that we still don't know about our oceans. So you can record that pod of dolphins, see if you can count them, identify that whale, write down your position when you see them, because you might be seeing something that scientists don't know about. There's just so much for everyone to learn. It doesn't matter how experienced you are. The boat needs looking after, lots of different jobs need doing. So there's something for everyone, basically. I've never really understood it when people say that they think they might get bored. But I think sometimes it's because of an old-fashioned blue jobs and pink jobs mentality, where the men look after the boat and the women look after the men. But a lot of women have told me that they feel estranged in that sort of setup. And it's so much better for morale if everyone is involved and understands the basics of running and sailing the boat, because everyone needs to feel at home on board. And it's an important safety factor, particularly if you're a couple. We hear tragic stories every year about people falling overboard or having some sort of crisis, and their lone crewmate is unable to rescue or help them. If there are only two people on board, both should have the confidence to navigate, take the helm, and understand the basics. And if that's not there already, it's something to work on and build up.
Jane, what about fear? I've personally met a lot of people who want to cross Atlantic, but they're nervous about doing it. In fact, they're often totally put off by these scary stories.
Yeah, fear is something that everyone experiences, and it's not something to be afraid of or ashamed of. I try to encourage people to think through their worst case scenarios, to help them to be prepared for the things that could go wrong, which can be a scary process in itself. But facing up to your fears is a process that usually then means that things don't go wrong in the first place, because you've thought it through and you've prepared for it. One example is understanding how the life raft works. You can watch while your life raft's being serviced, or you can have a play in the swimming pool. Either way, it helps to take some of the fear away. If you're then in any sort of borderline situation and you need to start thinking about whether you might deploy the life raft, it's not that complete unknown. It's something that you then feel slightly familiar with, which helps with your confidence, helps you to make better decisions. So you can go through that same process with a lot of your worst case scenarios. One of the most important things for everyone is to feel confident about how to act in a man overboard situation. It's surprisingly difficult to pull somebody out of the water in anything other than a flat calm. And particularly if there's only one person left on board, specialist help equipment can be really, really helpful, but you do need to practice to build up the confidence to use it. Hopefully you'll never need it. Remembering to clip on is a really good way of staying attached to the boat in the first place, but practice leads to confidence.
Absolutely. I think that's a point that can't be stressed enough. Okay, let's move on to some of the good stuff. Do you have any favorite places you would recommend?
Well, obviously I love them all. I do have a soft spot for the rears of northwest Spain and the Islas Cies. That area is a great cruising ground, and you've got some boats just starting out when they get there. They've come down from Northern Europe, some have come over from the US or Canada. It's a good crossroads, and it's a good point on the carousel. And then the Atlantic Islands are wonderful, absolutely stunning landscapes. They can feel a bit bleak and barren when you first arrive, but actually it's well worth getting ashore and exploring. Barbados was my first Atlantic crossing landfall at New Year party time, so this is Carlisle Bay. That gets a special mention too from me. And the Caribbean in general has a lot more to it than just lovely beaches and pina coladas. There's so many amazing places to visit. The music, Carnival's a real highlight.
Jane, those are all lovely warm spots. We're based in the slightly colder England. Any of the colder spots appeal to you?
Well, cooler. I'm not sure about cold yet, but I would love to sail into New York. I haven't done that yet. It feels amazing to sail into any of the world's great capital cities, and I've sailed into a few, but I'm sure New York arrival is more iconic than most. And it's another gateway into Long Island Sound and on up the coast. You could spend years cruising Maine and Nova Scotia. That's the problem, really. You could literally spend a lifetime exploring all the cruising grounds around the North Atlantic. And if you're like me, you find that the more places you visit, the longer your list grows of all the other places you haven't yet been to.
So how would you actually recommend people choose where they want to go to?
Well, a lot of that's down to how much time is available to you, obviously. The chart viewer on the Navionics website is great. It's really great for passage planning early on, before you've decided where you want to go. So before you want to commit to buying specific chart coverage, you can do lots of research, think about your timings, measure off distances, get an idea of where you might get to. So it's a great place to start.
And Jane, for those who worry about chart accuracy, is this an issue in the Atlantic?
Yeah, some people do worry about this. Actually, chart accuracy, either paper charts or electronic charts, is pretty good around most of the Atlantic circuit. But it is really important to remember to cross-check your navigation in other ways. For example, on the northern routes, there are definitely some areas which are poorly charted or not charted at all. So you do need to be sensible about your navigation, and particularly if you're going into some of the wilder areas. If you're using electronic charts, just don't become too dependent on your screen. Remember to use visual fixes as well. Don't forget to scroll in and out along your route to check the details of any hazards. Electronic charts are a fantastic tool to help with navigation, but always cross-reference with the other information that you have. And then you're more aware of anything unexpected more quickly, and you have more time to take the appropriate decisions. Coral waters can be tricky. You have to realize that even with electronic charts, some of the data does still come from pretty old sources from before we were all using GPS. And there are some places still where GPS positions don't match up with the charts. This catamaran was one of the unlucky ones. And if you rely too heavily on satellite positioning and don't do any cross checks, this is where you can end up. I think in coral waters, it's good to be as high on the boat as you can. It's good to have a high cockpit or get higher up in the rig so that you can see the deep and shallow areas by eye. And I try to climb up to high points ashore to check out the waters that we might be going to next and might want to explore. It's really informative to do that.
Jane, what about using satellite images to research places when you're passage planning? Is that a good idea?
Yeah, it can be really useful. It's another tool. Sometimes the images are great and you can see the rocks on the seabed, but sometimes it's not so clear or there's cloud and there can be other issues. But yes, I definitely recommend looking at satellite images of where you might want to go.
So, Jane, I guess some people will be wondering, do you just spend all of your time merrily circling the Atlantic, pulling together all this information?
Oh, I wish. No, a lot of the updates and photos for this edition have been sent in by other sailors who have been out there doing it more recently.
Can anyone get involved?
Yes, the Pilotage Foundation website has a cruising notes section. Sailors send information in from wherever they're cruising, and it helps to keep this book up to date, and other books. So anyone can go to the website and become part of the contributing team. Noonsight is a world cruising website, and that's another great place to share information with other cruising sailors.
So if you were to sum up your thoughts for anyone planning to head off across the Atlantic, what would they be?
Well, maybe this photo, which is another favourite. It sums up my thoughts pretty well, because even in the midst of paradise, we're all looking at our screens way too much. We have so much technology that we now just take for granted. Even in the middle of the Atlantic, we can interface with satellites from our navigation and our communication systems, and we can connect to the rest of the world. But I think ocean cruising is about enticing us to a wider horizon. We should all close our screens down a bit more often. We should luxuriate in having some time off grid. We should just enjoy the surge on the crest of the wave, the explosion of phosphorescence when a pod of dolphins swings past on the midnight watch. We should be watching for shooting stars across the full dome of the night sky. Those sorts of things. Those are the privilege of crossing an ocean, and those are the memories that stick with you forever. So I guess try to keep that bigger picture in mind when you're getting stressed with all the things on the to-do list.
Jane, thank you kindly. Hopefully there's some good things there for people to think about. Hopefully things to inspire people. I'd say the takeaway is be well prepared, think through those worst case scenarios, then get out there and make the most of it. Okay, we're going to see if we have any questions. I think we're back live with you now. We've got some questions that have been passed over to me here. Jane, what was your most scary moment crossing the Atlantic?
Everybody always asks that one. Well, there was the time with the orca, which was very interested in us for several days when we were heading down to the West Africa coast from the Canaries. And it was following us, and we could see it quite a long way off the stern, but then occasionally closer. And then something went wrong with the Aries wind vane, and we had to dangle off the back of the boat and sort out the paddle. And it came closer and closer, and eventually actually just surfaced right next to the boat, which obviously was a very privileged moment, but also a pretty terrifying moment.
Okay, I'm going to flip this question because people always say, what is the most scary moment? I'm going to say to you, what was your favorite moment, or what is some of your favorite moments?
Well, Christmas Day mid-Atlantic, I think, was a good one, and we weren't all that prepared for it. I remember that's my memory of not being very prepared and rummaging about in the cupboards and finding a tin of black cherries and making a chocolate sponge and having chocolate sponge with black cherries and cream, and we thought that was the best thing we'd ever had, and it really made our Christmas Day.
Okay, right, let's have a look at the next question. Do you get scared of big waves?
Well, it's all relative, but out at sea, the longer wavelength is a much easier and less scary ride, even with rollers. So and downwind is less scary. So yes, I think coastal passage making can sometimes be much worse.
Okay, and I'm getting some more questions in. Let's have a look. We've got one here. We've got, where can I buy the book? We're going to get onto that in a minute because we've got details on that. I think it's coming up. I think you can see that on the screen. How can I learn, this is a good one, how can I learn more about current customs and immigration requirements for entering foreign countries?
Okay, well, there is a section on formalities in the book, so that is a place to start, but also sites like Noonsight are often very useful. If you go onto the Noonsight website, you can then go through to the different countries, and there's usually a section on formalities, which is very helpful. And then also you can go to official government websites. and some of those are also given in the book. But if you Google the country that you're thinking about visiting and go to entry requirements, you can normally find some really good information there.
Right, let's go on. I've got a few more questions here. This is one of the more popular ones. Any tips, Jane, on seasickness?
Yeah, I do suffer very badly from seasickness, so it is something I've had to deal with, and I think different people develop different strategies. You can take pills. There are the patches that you put behind your ears, which were really good from my point of view. But then there's actually other ways of just preparing yourself, and I think the general advice is to try to keep everything as straightforward as possible the first few days at sea. Get your food prepared, keep everything quite simple. Don't try to do too much those first few days at sea, and before you go to sea, try and cut down on the stuff that your body's treating like a toxin. So that's stuff like caffeine and alcohol, and even stuff that's heavy to digest, lots of red meat, that sort of thing. Try to cut back on that for a day or so before you go to sea, and hopefully you'll find it easier to cope with the seasickness. If you are being sick, try to keep your fluids up, and try and get some sleep wherever that's easiest.
I think to endorse that, I'd agree with Jane on that one. I think from our personal point of view, things we used to do on the first day is, like Jane says, just take it easy, relax. Don't try and get things complicated. We wouldn't hoist spinnakers. We even banned fishing. We chatted to each other, pre-cooked meals, so all that sort of good stuff. Talking of spinnakers, Jane, would you recommend a spinnaker?
Well, it depends. It depends on how many people are on board, and it depends on the conditions, obviously. And it also depends whether you're monohull or a multi-hull, because it's much more straightforward to fly something like a spinnaker from a multi-hull than a monohull. And there are other sails that you might use, like a parasailer, which helps to keep things under control and now becoming quite popular. I think you just need to look at the whole picture of people's energy levels, how many people on board, what the conditions are, and then make a judgment about whether it's sensible to fly a spinnaker or not.
Yeah, and again, I agree with Jane. Just always bear in mind, a spinnaker is a sail for light downwind sailing. My tip on that one is that you should think about, when you're hoisting that spinnaker, sit in the cockpit and walk through what you're going to do. Talk to each other, talk to your crew, say, okay, stage by stage, this is what we're going to do. Okay, we've got quite a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to try and have to pick some ones at random. There's a simple fun one here. Do you recommend fishing en route?
Yes, I do. That's really rewarding, actually. There's a very basic reward from being out there, catching a fish, getting it on board successfully, and then straight to the cooking. And there's, yeah, that's a great feeling, actually. And people have their favorite contraptions for fishing with. We've always kept it quite simple, and haven't used a rod, but other people use rods, and enjoy catching bigger fish. We try and actually not catch bigger fish, because then you've got to deal with them and maybe refrigerate or freeze. So yeah, it's up to you, but yes, I think fishing's great.
Yeah, and again, I endorse that. Fishing is fabulous. It gives you something to do on crossing an ocean when there's times where you're sitting twiddling your fingers a bit. Fishing is entertaining. Right, we do have a lot. What would you recommend for meteo? So that's, what would you recommend in terms of weather, looking at the weather when you're en route?
Okay. Weather obviously is a really important topic, and I'm not sure we're going to do it justice here. There's a whole chapter on it in the book. There are a lot of apps and weather sites now which enable you to access weather information over a period of time. Some of them are based on American models, some of them are based on European models, some of them have human interpretation factored in for localized conditions, some of the models don't. So my advice with weather information is to do your research and check out the different ways that you can access weather, from a very straightforward grid file, which is unadorned, to some of the apps like Predict Wind or Passage Weather or whichever you prefer, and monitor them before you go on passage, get to know them, and then start to read the patterns a bit. And again, don't rely on one source. Use a variety of sources, including radio weather where you can access it. Some of the government weather sites are great. The French Meteo site is a good example. So yes, it'll depend on whether you have a satellite phone or a radio to access your weather, but you need to do the research and make sure that you are understanding what you're looking at when you receive the weather information.
And I think one important thing to emphasize, that there is a lot of information out there. There's a lot of technology that you can use now, but make sure also you understand what you are comfortable with, what you are comfortable with in sailing, what conditions you're happy to go out into. You know your boat, you know your own limitations, so take that into account when looking at a weather forecast. Don't be bullied by other ones. Okay, we have got a heck of a lot of questions. I'm going to read the next one. When do you need to leave the Caribbean to avoid the hurricane season?
Okay, so you need to be, it depends on the route you're planning to do, but you really need to be clear of Bermuda. If you're heading back across to Europe, you need to be clear of Bermuda by the end of June, and you're beginning to push it even then, really. So that's your time window.
Right, I'm going to have a look at a few more here. Richard, can you just scroll down a little bit for me there, and I can try and see some more of those questions.
There's one here about suggested watch patterns for a crew of 4. The important thing with watch patterns, I think, is understanding about body clocks, and we all have a slightly different body clock, and so I think there does need to be a little bit of flexibility amongst you as a group while you work out who prefers mornings, who prefers evenings, all of that kind of thing. But the bottom line, I think, is to try to stick to a 24-hour pattern. So with 4 people on board, you might do a 2 hours on, 2 hours off as pairs, or you might do a longer period of time, or you might want to have people on watch as individuals. But whatever your cycle is, it needs to really be a 24-hour cycle, because if it starts to become a 25, 26-hour cycle or less than that, you end up with a time shift every day in terms of your body clock that you don't get into an established 24-hour cycle, which really muddles your body up and makes you feel a lot more exhausted than if you're on the same regime each day. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and again, from my point of view, I think Jane makes a valid point there about talking to your crew, seeing what they're comfortable with, seeing how people's body clocks work. People have different ways their body clocks work. Watch systems can become quite personal. People can get upset about them. So engage your crew, reach out to them, talk to them, get their feedback.
I think it's nice as well, if you are a crew of 4, to have a period during the day, which I think on most boats tends to be late afternoon, early evening, where you're all together, where you just get together as a whole crew and probably eat together, or just you know, have a cup of tea together, whatever it is that's right on your boat. But a time during each day where you are together as your little community, I think that's really good for morale.
Okay, we're going to go for one more question. Let's have a look. What do you think, Jane? We've got a question there on where's the best place to leave from when crossing back across from the Atlantic to the UK?
Oh, help. Well, yes, how long's a piece of string? It depends where you are, where you've been cruising. So that's actually a really difficult question to answer. Are you coming from the Caribbean? Are you coming from the east coast of the States? I think depending on where you are, you're either going to go via Bermuda, or you're going to cut that corner either north or south and go across to the Azores. Or of course, if you're heading north, you'll be heading northwards from there. So sorry, there's too many route possibilities.
Okay, I was going to wrap it up, but there's one more question come in here. We're going to answer it. Was there some piece of equipment or food stuff you wished you had on board with you for your transatlantic? So I'm going to give you a challenge here, Jane. I'm going to say you're limited to one thing, and then I'll try and think quickly while Jane's answering the question on what my one thing would be.
I don't know. The spare that you want is always the one that you haven't got. And actually, that is one of the tricks, is to try to think through the equipment that you've got on board, to work out what you might need spares for, and try and forestall that concern. I don't know, actually, a Christmas tree. I'm being silly. What do you think? Is there anything? There's nothing that leaps into my mind now.
I mean, there's two ways I look at it, and I think, yeah, absolutely. In terms of tools and equipment, you obviously try and work on your boat a lot before you leave, because you're going to find that awkward position that you need some critical tool that you can probably only get back home. So make sure you're servicing your engine, your generator, your water maker. In terms of fun things, Christmas tree is a good idea. Christmas cake, heck, I missed having Christmas cake when I was going around the world. So that's one sort of fun thing that I really miss. But in all honesty, you'll be surprised once you get out there how much is available. A lot of people do probably panic a little bit and take too much with them. I think when you're traveling, embrace it. Try and trial these new foodstuffs, and that's part of the experience.
Yes, I think when we were first starting off, we had way too much stuff on board, too much rather than too little. Yeah.
Okay, so appreciate that. That was a lot of good questions there. My thank you again to Jane for taking part in this webinar. Our thank you to Navionics. We hope you enjoyed it today. Highly recommend you get out there and get the book. We're going to leave you with a slide that gives details on where to get the book.
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you, and thank you to everybody who was involved with creating the book, including Navionics, who were great and worked with us to help us with chartlets, which was really, really good for this edition. And do get in touch with us at the Pilotage Foundation website and get involved. Thanks, everyone.
Cheerio.